Hey, I've got a quick question for you as we start today. How impatient are you? Now, maybe that depends on the context or the situation or who's involved with it, but really think about this. How impatient are you? I know for me, the time that you're going to see me at my worst, when I'm the most impatient, is when I am driving. That is when the worst of me comes out and I just cannot stand it. Well, today, as we continue week 2 of our series Temptation, we're going to be talking with Pastor Trevor about the temptation to get something immediately and painlessly, and how Jesus faced that as well. Now, before we jump into the rest of our service for today, I want to ask you to do something simple, something that will be helpful, because I want to know that you are here today. Here's what I'd love for you to do. Pull out your cell phone right now and text the word HERE, H-E-R-E, to 801-794-5338. And that'll just let me know that you're here with us. I know I can't necessarily talk to you directly, but I would love to know that you are here with us at SMCC Online today. Thank you so much for being here today, and welcome to SMCC Online.
Thanks for joining us today. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Trevor. I serve as one of the pastors here at SMCC, and I got to give a quick shout out to the South Jordan campus here right at the beginning. Good to be here with you all this morning. We'll be together for about 30 minutes, and then I'll toss it back to the band, but looking forward to the time together. So with that, let me go ahead and open up with a question, just something I want to ask you, and it's this. Have you ever noticed how some people don't like to wait? Or better yet, let me put it this way. Have you ever noticed how you don't like to wait? I know that's true in my own life. It's something I've seen with myself. For example, just a couple of weeks ago, my wife and I, and we had our kids in tow, we were coming up to the Draper area just a little while back on a kind of a midweek night, and we live down in Lehigh. And so the fastest route, majority of the time for us to take, is to just hop on I-15, to just get on the highway, kind of sail right over the point of the mountain and come flying in to Draper in that way. But on this particular evening, when we were just about to the highway, a couple of raindrops fell from the sky and they landed and hit the ground. And just like that, immediately, traffic on I-15 came to a complete halting stop. And I saw that and immediately pivoted, saying there's no way I'm getting on there. And for a little while, I gotta say, I actually felt kind of proud of myself. For a little while, I felt so clever because I shifted over to Minuteman, which basically takes the same route over. And I'm chugging right along, watching all these cars stop on the highway, having this kind of internal celebration that I dodged the backup and am still making good time. I was celebrating for a little while. And then, all of a sudden, I started to hit some traffic of my own, and I came to the sudden realization that I was far from the only clever person on the road that night. And all of a sudden, instead of chugging right along, I was stuck in a 20-minute backup on a 2-mile stretch with no off-ramps, no exits, no other roads to take, watching cars on the highway sail by because that traffic had finally cleared up. And I don't know about you, but when I find myself in a situation like that, I start to get a little bit antsy. I start to get a little bit agitated. I start to get a little bit upset because I don't like it when things take longer than I feel that they should. Anybody ever feel like that? I think to some extent it's kind of a universal thing. And not everything's bad about it, right? To want efficiency, to want things to happen in a good time. And yet, I think what is interesting with it is when you begin to evaluate and just consider what does that desire, what do those expectations actually produce within a life? In the short term, I think really what it amounts to is frustration and anger and agitation, just leading you to be someone that no one else wants to be around in that moment, right? Which is just the effect there. But in the long term, what I think we often fail to consider is that what it goes on to produce is something that can have so much more severe consequences than just what we see in the short term. Because I think what this can lead to, what it can produce within our lives, this desire to get everything and everywhere as quick and as fast and as painless as we possibly can, is this flightiness. Right? It produces within us a flightiness, even this inability to commit to things over the long haul, because we're always second guessing the path that we're on, always second guessing the road that we're on, looking to see if there is some way to get there faster and to get there in a way that is easier. About that particular tendency, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, which is about the best attempt I can give at pronouncing his name, he wrote this. He says, the essential thing in heaven and earth is that there should be long obedience in the same direction. Thereby results, and it has always resulted in the long run, something which has made life worth living. The essential thing in heaven and earth is that there should be long obedience in the same direction. Now, granted, I do have to give a little caveat here that when it comes to what this man thought and wrote and believed, I disagree with the vast majority of it. But when it comes to this line, this particular individual single sentence, I think he was onto something pretty profound here. That when it comes to life, and even the larger, the big categories of life, things like friendship and marriage and career and even place and community, the thing that really brings about and cultivates a sense of meaning and significance to those different categories of our lives is a long obedience in the same direction. And when we jump from thing to thing to thing and are always second guessing the path that we're on, what that can do is cut that long obedience off right at the root. And that is a particular temptation, I believe, that we face today. So today we're continuing our series called Temptation, where we're walking through the three key temptations that Jesus faced right at the very beginning of his ministry. The goal for this series as a whole being to really take temptation, to break it down, understand its structure so that we can understand what it is and know how to respond to it well in the context of our own lives. And last week, we really focused on this key idea that's really underpinning the entire series, that every temptation is a whispering lie. Every temptation is a whispering lie. And we showed how that played out in Jesus' first temptation, and now we're jumping into the second one. And what we begin to see with the second temptation that he faces is a challenge to an assumption that we often have around temptation. That assumption being that when we're being tempted to something, it's always something bad. That it's always something evil, something wicked, something that's not good for us or for those around us, that the temptation is always about the thing we're being tempted to. But what the second temptation goes on to show us is that temptation isn't always about what we're trying to attain, but about how we're trying to attain it. Temptation isn't always about what we're trying to attain, but also about how we're trying to attain it. And when it comes to the second temptation, that really is the meat of it. It's about the strategy. It's about the means rather than the end, about the how rather than the what. And the logic of the series, following that key idea, is that if every temptation is a whispering lie, then the best way to resist temptation is to expose the lie within it. And that's exactly what I want to do over the rest of our time together today as we look into this temptation. Just like Scooby-Doo, to rip the mask off the villain and show it's not the minor 49er, it's just some guy named Hank. That's exactly what our aim is to do with this kind of temptation today. And so to that end, really what I want to do is work through two sections together. The temptation that Jesus faces, and then the response that he has. And so the temptation and the response. And in doing so, hopefully that will give us the ability to understand how this works and how to respond well in our own lives. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into that first section now, the temptation. And with this, let's just jump into the passage and pick it up and see what we see here. So Luke chapter 4, starting at verse 5. This is the second temptation Jesus faces. The devil led him, meaning Jesus, up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, I will give you all their authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours. Now, real quick, just maybe one complication to take care of before we jump into it is that the devil is offering him all of these things, all the kingdoms of the world and all of their authority. One thing I want to clear up is that if we just took this passage and kind of ripped it from the context of the rest of the Bible, you could get the kind of the indication or the picture that there is some cosmic battle going on and the devil has staked out his territory and is defending it against God, and God has not been able to win it back yet. And let me just say that from the beginning to the end of the Bible, that is not at all the picture that we get. When it comes to good versus evil or God versus the devil, there is no competition, right? God is the ultimate authority, and there is not even a challenge against that. And so I want to make that clear, that the devil has no authority outside of what God has allowed him to have. But beyond that, when we jump into the actual words, the real exchange that takes place between them, what's interesting is that what the devil offers Jesus here is something that is already in the direction of where Jesus is heading. Right? To have all of the kingdoms and all of their authority, all their splendor at his bestowal, to have them under his authority, to have them in his grasp. Because Jesus is already the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, highest authority in all of reality, because he is God, the second person of the Trinity. And so in offering this temptation and making this offer, the devil isn't changing the what. What he's offering is an alternative how. He's offering a path to the very same place that is absent the cross, that is absent suffering, that is absent pain, that is absent patience, that is absent waiting, that is absent struggle all together. That is the temptation, a way to the very same place without having to go through the cross. And what's interesting is that's a temptation that Jesus faces here, but also it's a temptation that you and I encounter nearly every day of our lives. The temptation being that there is an immediate and painless way to get what you want. No matter what it is, no matter what the what is, there is a how that is immediate and painless. There is a better road than the one that you're on. There is a quicker and far faster and far less painful path than the one that you are currently on. And I think just to kind of tease this out, some of the ways that we see this, just for example, I didn't realize that when it came to getting cut, right, to getting fit, to having really the body that I desire, I mean to be looking good, I didn't realize that the only thing I had to do to get that was buy a Peloton. I didn't know it was that easy. Right? If I just buy this bike and set it up in my living room and play some music, then I'll have it immediate and painless. I'll have the body I want. Or take it another way, to have kind of the picture perfect family, I didn't realize the only thing I had to do was to take my wife and kids to Disneyland. Doesn't matter what I do the rest of the year, doesn't matter how I engage, as long as I get them there once or twice, hit up Splash Mountain, take a couple of pictures, then it is taken care of because old Walt has got it together for me. I didn't realize that was how it worked, but that's the temptation, that no matter what you want, there is an immediate and painless way to get it, a better road than the one that you're on. And I think really what we see when this lie has taken root within a person's life, the way it begins to manifest itself. Maybe you see this in the lives of those around you. Maybe you see some of these things in your own life, but just to kind of spell it out, when this whispering lie at the heart of this temptation has taken root, I think we begin to see it in the person who jumps from job to job to job, never really committing to any direction, always kind of just flitting from one thing to the next, never able to commit to any of them because the grass is always greener elsewhere. There's always some path that is moving faster. Or the person who really never settles down in any place for any length of time, but is always moving from place to place to place, never forming real community, never really knowing and being known by others. Or even the person who moves from relationships, from person to person to person, never committing to anyone over the course of the long haul, because what if there's someone better out there? What if there's someone better out there? And I don't know if that's you or not, or if it's someone that you see within your life. And maybe if it is you, you want these things. You want a family. You want a meaningful and a great marriage. You want a meaningful career. You want a place that feels like a home with community, people who know you, who love you, care for you, and support you, and where you are there for them in the very same way. Maybe these are all the things that you desire, but what you're worried about is committing to the wrong thing, to the wrong career, the wrong person, the wrong place. And I get that, and there is wisdom involved in what we commit to and who we commit to in this life. But I think the thing that we really need to be concerned about, that we need to watch out for, is that if we fall prey to living our lives according to this lie, to this temptation, what it could lead us to do is essentially waste our lives, to miss every opportunity for a good relationship, for community, for meaningful work, because we're always looking out for something better. Right? It can lead us to missing out. The fear of committing to the wrong thing can lead us to miss out on the fruit of commitment altogether. And really, the point I'm trying to make is that a meaningful life requires commitment. And there is wisdom involved in deciding what and who we commit to, but a meaningful life requires commitment. And that fits kind of these larger categories of life. And I would say that it plays into, perhaps even to a more significant degree, it plays into our spiritual lives as well, and to what it looks like to have a relationship with Jesus. Along those lines, Eugene Peterson, pastor and author, in his book, Along Obedience, he writes this, that one aspect of the world that I have been able to identify as harmful to Christians is the assumption that anything worthwhile can be acquired at once. One aspect of the world that I've been able to identify as harmful to Christians, you could say harmful to anyone really, is the assumption that anything worthwhile can be acquired at once, because that means if the road you're on is taking too long, you'll always be looking for the faster one. And we assume that if something can be done at all, it can be done quickly and efficiently. Our attention spans have been conditioned by 30-second commercials. I bet if he was writing this today, he'd probably be talking about how Amazon Prime has conditioned us even to a greater extent. When a package takes 3 days instead of 2 to show up, who doesn't notice that anymore? Right? And just by way of example, the other day I was, over this summer, I've been introducing my kids to Middle Earth. And so we've been getting into The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And over the summer, we read The Hobbit together, thought about reading Lord of the Rings. And then I decided they can get to that on their own when they're there. That's a little bit little long for a read aloud. But, we watched the Hobbit movies, and we got to the first Lord of the Rings movie, The Fellowship of the Ring, just a couple of weeks ago. And if I could just ask permission here, if I can just have permission to nerd out here for a moment. If this is not your thing, feel free to just kind of, roll your eyes and hold your breath. I promise this won't take long, but allow me the chance to connect with some of the other nerds out here for a moment. So we got to the end of The Fellowship of the Ring, and I didn't remember exactly how this movie ended, but it is such a cliffhanger, right? Where Gandalf dies, and they're trying to figure out what to do after that. And then before you know it, they get attacked by this horde of orcs, and Boromir dies. He gets lit up by that giant one. And then Frodo and Sam run off, just two little hobbits making their way to Mordor all by themselves. And then Merry and Pippin get captured, so the rest are trying to save them. And then just like that, right, with the whole group splintering and falling to pieces, all of a sudden the credits roll and the movie comes to a close. And I'm sitting there on the couch with my kids, just thinking about what a cliffhanger it is when all of a sudden in the corner pops up the option to go ahead and just play The Two Towers, to just roll the next movie. And just like that, right, bring an end to the tension, an end to the cliffhanger, and resolve every question. And I'm thinking to myself, I remember watching this as a kid and thinking, I gotta wait an entire year for this. And yet now they can just roll the next movie immediately. They don't have to wait at all. And I get that there's probably some old timers out there, some old time Star Wars fans who are saying, that's even weak sauce, because I didn't have to wait decades and then get disappointed by The Phantom Menace. I understand that, but the point is the same. We're not used to waiting for anything, because nowadays we really don't have to. We're not used to waiting for anything, because the way the world has become, we pretty much don't have to. And sometimes that plays into some of these far more significant areas of our lives where waiting is part of it, where a long obedience is really what it takes to bring about the fullness of what it has to offer. For example, there may be some of you, right, who you gave Jesus a shot right, for a week or two or a month or two, and then you were on to the next thing, into the next thing, into the next thing, because everything about your life wasn't changed in an instant. And what that strategy is looking for is just this instant fix, right? This kind of instant pot spirituality, this microwave solution to a problem that cannot be solved in a minute. Because what Jesus invites us into, it is a life with him that is marked by joy immediately. And yet as we continue to grow in our relationship with him, that joy grows in increasing measure over a lifetime. But when we jump from thing to thing to thing, we risk missing out on that. We risk missing out on the joy of a long obedience to Jesus. That's why our former lead pastor, Paul Roby, who founded SMCC, he used to say all the time that Christianity is hard before it gets easy, because immediately what it involves is a rewiring of our head, of our hearts, and even a redirecting of the activity of our hands, right? To kind of get out of the rut in the way of life that we were living in. And that takes time, and it doesn't happen without effort. And yet what it leads to is such an increasing of the joy that we find immediately when we trust in Jesus, when we move towards him. That joy continues to increase as our devotion to Jesus increases over the course of our lifetime. But when we jump from thing to thing to thing, what we risk is missing out on that particular joy, the joy of a long obedience to Jesus. And so that's the temptation. The temptation is to believe the lie that anything that's worth having in this life, anything we might want, we can have immediately and without effort, and there's always some better road to get there. That's the temptation. Now what I want to spend the rest of our time looking at is the response. How does Jesus respond to it? And is there anything we can learn from that in our own lives to then respond better? So with that, let's go ahead and pick it up, the final verse of the passage here. Luke chapter 4, verse 8. So again, the devil has offered him all of the kingdoms of the world, all of their authority and splendor. And this is Jesus' response. Jesus answered, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Worship the Lord your God and serve him only is his response. Now, Jesus is quoting from an Old Testament passage from the book of Deuteronomy, really one of the foundational, maybe the foundational book for understanding the rest of the Old Testament, because the logic that it establishes is what every other book in the Old Testament is written according to. But for our purposes, in this passage that he's quoting, Moses, a significant leader of the Israelites who actually wrote the book of Deuteronomy, he is delivering to the people a command in this passage that's being quoted. And when we go back to it, there's some further context in the broader passage that adds to our understanding concerning the point that Jesus is making. And so just going back to it, this is coming from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 13 and 14. Fear the Lord your God, serve him only, and take your oaths in his name. Do not follow other gods, the gods of the peoples around you. All right, so you can see the part that Jesus quoted. Fear the Lord your God. Fear in the sense of have a reverence for, live in a way that is worshipful, that honors and serves, right? That's the same meaning there. Fear the Lord your God, serve him only. That's what he quotes. But what Moses goes on to add in the broader context is do not follow other gods, the gods of the peoples around you. And what that leads us to understand is that at face value, sometimes we can look at it as saying that the command is to worship God, and I either do that or I worship nothing at all. And so it's adding something to my life, right? Whereas what the context teaches us is that we are always worshiping something. That the decision isn't about whether or not we worship, because that's how we are created. It's how we're hardwired. We will always worship something, and there's nothing we can do about that. The only question is, what will we worship? And that's what the command is giving guidance for. That's what the command is giving direction around, to worship God and not the gods of the people surrounding them. And just to give some context, what that was involved within that, the gods of the people who surrounded them, was some really horrific practices, things like child sacrifice and even the abuse of women and children, right? Awful things. And yet we see throughout the history of the people of Israel that they disobeyed this command. They went against it, and they did engage in the worship of these other gods. And I think the question that leads us to ask is just why? with all of the things that were wrapped up within the worship of these other gods, why on earth would they ever go against this command and do that? And I have to believe the answer is because they thought that these other gods could deliver on what they wanted in life faster. They thought that in worshiping and serving God alone, they were on the wrong road, on the road with traffic, on the slow and difficult and painful road and so they thought, if I just go over here and worship this God, and if I serve and follow him, then I will get what I want immediately. I'll get it faster. I'll get it better. It's the same exact temptation to worship something other than God because we believe it can deliver better. And that, in and of itself, is the lie. That is the lie. And that introduces a new question, even for us in this conversation. That when it comes to our own flightiness in life, kind of always looking for the path that's faster, for the road that's moving quicker, the question is, what are we really serving? Who are we really honoring? What or who is really the authority within our lives? And I think a lot of times we can be guilty. I know at times I have been guilty of really living as a servant of my own happiness, of doing whatever I could, of subscribing to and following whatever I believed would bring that about within my life. And let me just say, it's an understandable way to live. I get why we would orient our lives in such a way, because the opposite is so awful, right? To live according to anxiety and dread and fear and worry. Nobody wants to live in that way. And so it makes sense that we would live as servants of our own happiness. The only problem is it completely misses how joy and how happiness actually function within our lives. It misses a fundamental understanding about the way that we have been created, about the way that we have been wired. It misses it. Because the fullest joy is a byproduct of full devotion to Jesus. The fullest joy to be found in this life that we can experience is a byproduct of devotion to Jesus. It comes not by serving what we think will deliver to us happiness, or by serving our happiness in that particular way, but the fullest joy that we can find only comes through a life of devotion to and delight in Jesus. And that really is why the command was given. The command wasn't restrictive. The command was given as a fence to shape this conviction that the fullest life and the fullest amount of joy that we could possibly experience is found not by serving these other gods, by these other things, but in full devotion to God, by serving Jesus and honoring him with our lives. And we see that within the command. We see that within Jesus' response, how he calls out this lie and says, no, the full expression of what it means to be human, the fullest amount of joy is found not in what you are offering, but in remaining devoted to God. And we see that within his response. But I think what's fascinating when we bring up this theme of a long obedience is that we see it even in other ways, right? We see it throughout the entirety of the Bible, all 66 books, all of these, especially in the Old Testament, these prophecies and these little pictures that give us an indication of Jesus's commitment to us. For example, even the earliest one comes in Genesis chapter 3, basically the third page of the Bible, where humanity has just rebelled against God, severed our relationship with him. And right after that follows this prophecy that Jesus would one day, what it essentially amounts to is that Jesus would one day bring about our redemption. And what that tells us is that even as early as that and prior to it, he was committed to our good, to our joy, to our salvation. And even through the tangled mess of human history and through the twists and turns of his own life, he was not dissuaded from that. He wasn't put off by our errors, right? He wasn't put off by our flaws, but he remained committed to us one step at a time through the entirety of human history and through the entirety of his life, to the point that he gave his life on the cross in obedience and full devotion to God, knowing it would bring about our joy, the possibility of our salvation, and even the joy of his own. Because the gospel truth is that Jesus' long obedience in our direction brought us salvation and him joy. His long obedience in our direction, which led him directly to the cross, brought us salvation, and it brought him joy. Because that's what a long obedience lived in devotion to him can do. That's what it produces within our lives, not a flightiness that leads us to waste our lives, but it produces a devotion that leads to so much joy, so much significance, and to a fullness of life that cannot be found in any other way. Because the bottom line is, our long obedience to Jesus brings him glory and us joy. And that's exactly what he's invited us into. But if we're to break it down, really a life of long obedience is just a life of so many small, individual, single next steps taken one at a time, at a time, at a time. And so the question isn't about how to commit to an entire lifetime or an eternity, but the question is, how do I take one step after another? Just one step at a time. And with that, as we bring it to a close here, reflecting on this idea, on this truth, that our long obedience to Jesus brings him glory and us joy. My question for you is, what would a next step look like for you? A single next step to take towards greater devotion to and greater delight in Jesus in the direction of a life lived in long obedience to him. Let's pray together. Jesus, we thank you for the time together this morning. We thank you that we've been given this instruction, this teaching that you've even modeled for us, how a life of long obedience lived in devotion to you is what brings about joy, is what brings about meaning, is what brings about significance to all of these other areas of life, right? To our relationships, to our community, to our work. That when we grow in increasing devotion and an increasing delight to you, that has a way of infusing every other aspect, every other relationship and category of life and filling it with greater joy and greater meaning. So we thank you for the gift that is, and we ask that you would help us and give us the ability to continue on that path and to take a single next step towards you, towards greater devotion and greater delight, and to find joy in you always in increasing measure in doing so. We thank you, we praise you. In your name, amen.
Found love that never runs dry from
you, Trinity and the band, for leading us in that song that reminds us of the truth that Jesus' love extends farther than we could ever imagine. Now, before you go, I want to ask you of one quick favor. Please do this for me. I would love it if you would do this. Please make sure that you are subscribed on YouTube to our channel and like this video. Those two things help us out a ton, and it's a free way to help us to reach more people. So if you want to help us reach more people, that's a free and easy thing that you can do to help us. We will be back next week as we wrap up our temptation series here at SMCC Online and across our locations. I would love to see you here, or even really honestly, better yet, be at one of our locations next week. We'll be wrapping up our series in temptation. Pastor Eric will be bringing us that message next week. I hope that you will be here. Take care.